Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Teksoft Ventures. We're going to be talking today about top tips for customizing training for your company. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to talk about the technology that we're using today. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a control panel. You can slide that open and close by clicking on the arrow in the upper left-hand corner. You can also submit a question to us at any time during today's session. Just type your question into the box and click send, and we'll queue your questions up and get to as many as we have time for at the end of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Konn is president of Teksoft Ventures. She's responsible for the overall direction of the organization, and she also works with many companies to develop strategic education programs. She's got over 22 years of experience with ERP systems, 17 years experience in the adult learning arena, and has led a number of ERP education projects, including global rollouts for Fortune 500 companies, public sector organizations, and companies in the mid-market. We're always very happy to have Konn here with us. And with that, Jan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yes, what we're talking about today is truly how to customize your materials that really make sense for your end users or for your providers, understanding how they can take this academic learning and truly apply it to their new job roles after an ERP or an EMR implementation. And when we look at that, we're going to also look at some of the best practices, some tips and tricks, and of course we look at some good examples of what customization really means from a content perspective, as well as we also have to have that ominous case study of what happens when you deliver generic types of training to your end user constituency. So we're going to start with a couple of learning quotes. And we have an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage. So we know Jack Welch invested a lot in his folks at GE. We also know that with new hires, he did present to all the new hires that joined the organization. He felt the investment in his folks in those training programs were critical to the success of GE. Okay, knowledge becomes wisdom, but only when it's put into practical use. So knowledge for the sake of knowledge, not really a big deal, but how can we really apply this? And again, this ties in nicely with the customized training materials. The least of the work of the learning is done in the classroom. So again, if I don't take what I learned and apply it, much of that learning, you're going to lose it, and it goes for naught. I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. You know, in a lot of cases, especially with adult learning, you know, you've got different types of learners. We'd love to get folks on the system, be it an Epic system or a SAT system or Lawson, get them on the keyboard and understanding, getting through the keystrokes, but then making sure that they think about what they're doing and understand the whys and the whens, and again, trying to take that information and bring it back to their jobs. And without, we have George Burns here, by the time you're 80 years old, you've learned everything, you only have to remember it. For the under 30 crowd, you guys can go ahead and Google George Burns to see who he is. Okay, some basic adult learning assumptions and really theory. I mean, we're going to start off with a bit of theory, just as a backbone, and again, depending on who you folks have to sell this to in the organization, some of this learning theory can really be a good backbone and help you state your case. So really, we're looking at Malcolm Knowles, who back in the 80s came up with andragogy, which is basically talks about facilitating the development and implementation of the learning activities for adults. So we have the development of the activities, but also the implementation piece, which I think in many cases we have a tendency to forget about. We just feed people through a fire hose and we expect retention, and then we expect them to apply it. So really this andragogy has 5 basic adult learning assumptions. So if we look at, for example, self-concept. Self-concept is the idea that as adults or as folks mature, they are going to accept a lot of the learning responsibility on themselves and be self-directed. So they're going to less dependency, more self-directed. experience. Boy, how many times we've been out at clients and we say, adults learn by what they can relate to. So this is the experiences that adults draw into, or draw into to go ahead and relate it to something they know. So as an example might be, there's favorites in many different software systems. So we have favorites in software systems, and folks, for all of you on the internet, you know that you have a favorites up in your menu, and you can tag different websites onto your favorites. It works just like this in this software application that you're working with. Much easier for folks for it to be palatable for these folks if you can draw and compare it. Make it resonate with them. Make it applicable to what to something they already do. Readiness. Okay, adults are really ready to learn when there's a need for them to learn things like, my job is changing because we're implementing this new EMR system, and what I need to do is I need to learn that. So there's a motivational factor behind this, or this readiness. Orientation is, as we learn new knowledge as adults, we want to apply it immediately. That also is one of the best business practices when you're rolling out these large-scale training initiatives. Let's make sure we go ahead and deliver the training as close to production or go live as possible. And we also have this little informal learning slipping in. So the first time that they see their EMR system, their Cerner, or their Meditech, or other EMR system, or SAP or Oracle system, shouldn't be the first time they're in the classroom. But this is where a lot of the meat and potatoes, a lot of the real heavy lifting is going to be done from a learning perspective. But there's different ways, and we've talked about it a couple other seminars on or webinars, how to get out some of this informal learning before they sit in, for an example, in an instructor-led classroom. And the last one here is motivation, is that we'd like to think as we get older we're a bit more motivated to learn. I mean, I can remember being in high school and learning about Shakespeare, going, do I really want to learn this? Well, today, absolutely. So I think there's a maturity and a little bit more of a mature attitude towards learning. That, again, along with the number one bullet of self-concept and the motivation, is we're a lot more motivated. Hey, this is our job that's going to change. We need to learn it. And we have to have a responsibility to do that. So there's lots of learning theories out there. There's lots of, as it relates to adult learning theories, which certainly differ greatly than adolescents and children. But this one is something that I think that you can really tie this to some of this customized materials and what motivates adults or these learning assumptions. All right. Now let's talk about, this is an example of happens to be an SAP slide. And what I'd like to do is show you an example of this slide as a verbiage-only slide, and this slide as more of a visual slide that, again, people can relate to a little bit more. So this is just, and not to get into all the details here, but this is just a lookup. This is a customer lookup, looking up the invoices that are due, looking up how many invoices they have open or the payments that you've received. So it starts off, it talks about this is the customer line item change display, and we really have two different types of activities we perform here. We perform queries, where all we're doing is querying information based on our input parameters, and then we also do some processing from the same program. So all we have here is a bunch of words. Now at the end here it says, this replaces the account balance in J.D. Edwards screen 19. So this is that hook. This is that experience, that third bullet on Noel's assumptions, or that second bullet is, experience by what they know. Okay. Oh, I know. I've worked with J.D. Edwards here as a user in Screen 19. I'm in it all the time. Okay, so now I know that I've got a new transaction, FBL5N, that replaces my Screen 19. So it's given me that bridge from a transactional perspective. Now what I have to do as a user is get used to the new screens and so forth, but I now understand the application for this new transaction based on what I already know. Now, again, kind of boring. We could put a clip art or a picture in there. But if you can look at it this way and look at this more as a visual, and notice too with these slides is we put in your best friend. So we name it. And because this happened to be a transaction that this certain user group was in and out of all the time. So if you're a purchasing agent and you're in a purchase order create screen all the time or change or display, these folks are more on the collection side and the receivable side. They're always looking at this customer account. So now what we've done is we've made the slide a bit more visual. We're putting a title in here, Your Best Friend. Why? Because this is where they're going to find all their stuff. And these folks are customer facing. The last thing that they want is to experience any anxiety because they can't find something on a new system while they've got the client or the customer on the phone. So instead of all this verbiage, and we've just kind of painted this a bit more visually, is we have a query side, much like, you know, in the verbiage in many cases it's the same, but we can, as an instructor or facilitator, I'm going to talk a little bit more about viewing the payer and the branch data from a query, and then I can look at this from the processing side as well. So this is a slide, too, that you can repeat and just color the different boxes depending on which unit that you're in for this particular class or for this particular transaction code, because, again, this transaction for this user constituency was used throughout the particular class. And then here at the bottom, we have what it replaces. Now, in some cases, you might even put a screenshot of J.D. Edwards, that old screen, and the new screen, just again to do a compare and contrast. And this also helps folks feel comfortable because they know they aren't going to be in a system, as an example, without a good customer lookup while they have the customers on the phone. So we have an example here of customizing it more from a little bit more visual perspective, but we're going to look at another example here of customization. And this is the same. These are collectors, or these are folks, this is a whole class, and these are collectors that had to work in work lists and callbacks and disputes and so forth. So as an example here is we have different topics for this unit. We're going to talk about customer master, etc. And what I'd like to do is really show a bit more on the today and tomorrow. Some people call it as is and to be. Some call it old and new. But what this, again, does is bridge the gap. And folks, I can't tell you how many times we've been at clients where we've gone and done upgrades, and I see extremely, extremely generic materials. And again, people don't learn by that. So here's an example where today they have to go into the software SS123, and now tomorrow we've got the different transaction codes. We've got it's called a customer today, but they're called branch and sold tools tomorrow. Those are huge, very, very different terminology in going from the old and the new systems. And then here we have something called a customer representative on today, and now depending on what system they're in, there's 3 different names for that one name before or in their today field. So again, we have to make sure that they understand that in going forward. Otherwise, they will struggle with the terminology, they will struggle with the process differences, and they won't learn. And they would be lucky if they learned keystrokes. And learning keystrokes is nothing more than the hows, and it becomes a learning by rote. They don't think about what they're doing, and they don't know how to do it if they get taken off any type of script. And then another example here is collect at the invoice level. Now they collect at the payer level. That's a huge process change. And the first time they come into any type of formal learning, they should already know this through different informal vehicles that I spoke to before. So there's a lot of different ways to get this information out to them and socialize to them without formal learning. And what happens then is those folks already understand the process changes. They already understand they're going to be collecting at the payer level and not at the invoice level, and then that instructor or facilitator can also go ahead and make sure that they cover that and reinforce that in the training. Other terminology, the term and definition from the old to the new, again, very, very critical here to make sure that they understand that. Okay, the other thing that you want to make sure that's put in these units is what type of scenarios affect them. Okay, so as a collector, and we're in a customer master record, we know that billing, people that do the billing in an organization are in a customer master record. We know that folks that create customer master records, we know that customer service, and we know that sales are in customer master records, as well as receivables and credit folks. But they all have different needs. So what you want to make sure is that the scenarios in the unit are real. So this was a lot of customization in this particular system. They said they need to change a contact person who receives a copy of the bill. They want to know who their representative is, and they need to create multiple contacts and just different things that apply to their job role. So again, they can relate to it. Talks a little bit here about customer master overview, and then again, we have a different terminology here in the little pop-up here in the bottom that talks about the customer field is not this, it's now this. Because, again, if they don't understand that, the rest of this information will not trickle through and learning will not occur. So even though these folks don't create master records, there's a whole new process for how they're created. We just give them a little process flow on how they are created, who does what, which again is very important for them to understand, just at a high level. They don't need to create customers because that's not part of their job role, but in this case, when there are issues and changes need to be made, they needed to go to different folks in order to get changes corrected, so they needed to know this change in this particular process. Removing the noise is very important. So in a customer master record in many different systems, or a patient record, there might be 100, there might be 300 fields. In this different scenario, there's about 15 fields that affect a customer, a cash financial person here, or a collector. And for those are the fields you highlight. You don't talk about the fields that have nothing to do with their job role. Okay, and this is just a screen of what they're doing and some of the changes that they will be making. So what we've done is that this was an example at a client or with a collector job role that had some very specific duties that needed to be done within their new system. We focus on those duties. We hit the exercises hard with these different scenarios in that one slide that you saw in order for them to go ahead and truly maximize the learning output and transfer knowledge appropriately. Okay, we have a case study here for emergency medical records, or EMR system. And for the folks that aren't in the EMR space or the EHR space and they're more in the ERP space or vice versa, it all applies, folks. It all applies. The reason is many folks try to deploy generic training. And the classic example here is one of the large EMR systems is a system called Epic. Epic provided, this is Aurora Healthcare. They have, I don't know, maybe a dozen hospitals, maybe 20 hospitals, and they were converting their EMR systems from Cerner to Epic, which is like converting from legacy systems to Oracle or to SAP in the ERP space. Epic provides training materials. And these materials are pretty substantial, where they cover the various functions and the various processes. Okay? The problem is these are generic materials. So this is much like I get a manual, and I've driven a car before, and the manual is to drive an automatic transmission car, and then when the real car comes, it's a 6-speed. This is exactly the same concept here. They're getting training on an automatic, and the delivery is they really needed to get trained on the 6-speed. So this was a source. This was a document, and what they did is they evaluated the Aurora Healthcare AHC's training program. And so this person interviewed folks, surveyed folks, and compiled the results and the themes. And the biggest issue was that, or the basic findings was that the structure of the training classes was good, that the training materials that Epic provided or the software vendor provided were adequate. Okay? They were a good foundation. The biggest issue, or the most dissatisfaction, revolved around the customization, or let me say the lack of customization, and the generic, trying to use generic workflows and processes that did not match AHC's processes and workflows. So, again, the base core training materials gave you a good understanding of the Epic application. The caregivers would like the curriculum to apply more to their specialty. For folks in EMR, emergency room nurses have different needs than surgical nurses, than oncology nurses. You can't just treat the nurses as one role-based group, much like when you have different roles in ERP where you have different folks that receive goods or different folks that work the transportation angle. So you just can't treat warehouse receivers or shippers in one bucket. They learn there's different job roles, therefore you have to have different training materials that reflect what they're going to be doing on the job. The training needs to be tailored. Again, this is the customization piece. Real hospital workflows. This ties into real scenarios, real workflows. How are we really going to be doing it? I've had a lot of clients that said, oh yeah, training went well, but then on Monday morning when folks got back to their desks, they didn't know what to do. And that's all what this Malcolm Knowles and his 5 assumptions here are really trying to do, is bridge the academic learning with how they're going to apply it. The trainers were knowledgeable about Epic, but they weren't knowledgeable about their specific processes and why. IT delivered the training. They didn't have caregivers or people that were down in the trenches delivering the training. So it's very IT focused and less user focused, or looking at it from a user perspective. Training, the sandbox process was cumbersome, and caregiver competency was not determined. You have to determine and measure competency. Why would anyone send thousands of people, and why would an organization invest in thousands of people, sending them to a day, 2 days, 3 days of training, and not measure their proficiency? That just doesn't make sense to me. Help the adult learners invest in themselves to learn here. Okay, along with the same case study is one of the largest or biggest negatives was the lack of knowledge of the trainers to the specific process and workflow. So the trainers again knew the generic because they had generic materials, but no one went in and from an organizational change perspective looked at the different type of processes that were being improved in best business practices, and no one got that into the training because they assumed the generic would work. The physicians wanted to know how they would use the application day to day, but the trainers couldn't provide that information. Again, because there wasn't any effort given for those particular endeavors. This is kind of funny. One of the major dissatisfactions is the physicians could not access the sandbox or the learning environment to improve on their learning, so they gave up. So I don't know what that says, but that could be a bit scary. Okay, some key learning here points is that make the learning interactive. You know, we don't want to have the Charlie Brown teacher or the Ben Stein teacher in Ferris Bueller. We want to really make it interactive. Do some buddy learning. Try to emulate or simulate how these people will be back at their desks as much as possible. Give them problems to solve and make them think. Lots of hands-on. That appeals to many adults, in that one quote that says, if I do, I understand. real life scenarios, you know, customer number one, vendor number one, patient number one. That doesn't work. You've got to have the real McCoy here. Process flows, simple process flows, and the instructor should really become more of a facilitator. So we looked at Malcolm No's andragogy examples of those 5 points. Again, they can help you folks when you're starting to, I think, help to sell this or state your cause with any type of stakeholders and management and getting some budget dollars. A couple of customization examples. We looked at something a little bit more wordy and then more visual and what will stick better. Looked at that EMR case study and some key learning points.
Thanks very much, Jan. We do have time now for a brief Q&A session. And before we get to that, I just want to launch a quick poll. If you have questions about customized training, if you want to review your current training program with Teksoft, you want to ask them about that, please indicate to us an anonymous poll if you'd like to do so. And while you're doing that and clicking your choice, we'll get to our Q&A. And Jan, the first question that we have here is, do you have any tips on socializing learning concepts to office management and other key stakeholders?
Well, I think the real key is you have to get some weaponry behind you, and I think Malcolm Knowles, I think that's a good start when you look at, let's take some theory, but it's very common sense approach, and I think you then tie that to some real examples of what's worked in the past, what hasn't. Case studies are also very valuable, the do's and don'ts of learning for either ERP or EMR applications or implementations. And I think you got to find your coach, find your couple of coaches and advocates, and have them help spread the word as well, because you're going to have people that don't believe in training, and this takes work, folks. You know, if you want to just do generic stuff that isn't going to work, the amount of time that takes compared to really customizing this and putting yourself in your provider's roles or your end user's roles, it takes more time. And more time means what? More money and investment. You're not going to sell it to everybody, but I think you start doing some research and getting some good basis on your side, and then take it from there.
Thank you, Jan. Another question that we have here is, how can you ensure that the proper today and tomorrow items are in the content?
Okay, there's a couple ways to do that. Probably the best way is, hopefully for your organizations, you've implemented some sort of a formal organizational change program. Number one, the organizational change program should talk about and should have the organizational impacts. If not, it becomes a burden on training. But what you have to do is you have to see what the OCM approach is, and then you might have to then accept some of the work and the responsibility entailed if, in fact, that OCM department that isn't part of their specific job role. As an example, at a couple clients, we've had organizational change departments that say, we're just communications. We don't know process. We're not doing those process changes or those organizational impacts. Well, that then needs to be brought up to your project management office and then decided how this work gets done, because the fact of the matter is training will have a less success rate, and I mean substantially less success rate, if those todays and tomorrows don't get into the business, into the materials. The todays and tomorrows from the terminology change, from a transaction code change, as well as from a job role and process change. All of that needs to get into those materials.
Well, thank you so much, Jan. We are at the 30-minute mark, and that's where we try to keep these webinars, so we'll stop right there. We do encourage you, if you have questions, you want to talk about training, or you would like a copy of today's web seminar, go ahead and reach out to Gary Remersma. His phone number and email address are on the screen. And visit TekssoftVentures.com for more information about training and many of these things we talked about today. And with that, we thank all of you for being here. Of course, we thank Teksoft Ventures for sponsoring today's web seminar, and we thank Jan Konn for presenting. We look forward to seeing all of you at a future Teksoft Ventures webinar very soon. And with that, we hope everyone has a great afternoon.